Well, good morning, afternoon, etc. I want to sort of introduce the Discourse on Method. And you have a PDF file of this thing, and it is by Rene Descartes, who we will talk about later in the course. He's a modern thinker. However, believe it or not, we're actually modeling Descartes' Discourse on Method in the course. I've chosen to kind of organize the course along these lines. So you have a 5-page document, and I want to sort of walk you through a couple of important facts. Look, if you will, on page 503, and you'll notice I've got my notes all over it. I know it's a little confusing, but you can make it out. Notice toward the bottom it says start here. There's a big arrow, and it says, I am delighted most of all in mathematics because of the certainty and evidence of its reasonings. But I did not yet notice its true use, and, thinking that it was of service merely to the mechanical arts, I was astonished by the fact that no one had built anything more noble upon its foundations, given that they were so solid and firm. So notice that he's talking about math and its certainty. This is going to be important because a huge part of philosophy is coming to understand what is certain. How can we know things? As opposed to opinion, right? And so there's a distinction between truth and certainty versus opinion. So continuing on 503, you'll notice there's a paragraph that says on the right-hand side, it says, concerning philosophy, you should say only that. Go down a few lines, and you'll see what I have underlined. Considering how many opinions there can be about the very same matter that are held by the learned people without there ever being the possibility of more than one opinion being true, I deemed everything that was merely probable to be well nigh false. So, again, what is he saying? He's saying this, is that there are always multiple perspectives on things, right? And so then the idea becomes, well, how can you be sure of certainty considering that there are so many perspectives? Hence the importance of something like math, because there are not too many, different opinions on whether 2 and 2 is 4. Continuing on page 504, on the left-hand column, you'll see the part that I have underlined. For it seemed to me that I could find much more truth in the reasonings that each person makes concerning matters that are important to him, and whose outcome ought to cost him dearly later on if he is judged badly, than in those reasoning engaged in by a man of letters in his study, which touch on speculations and produce no effect, and are of no other consequence to him, except perhaps that, the more they are removed from common sense, the more pride he will take in them, for he will have to employ that much more wit and ingenuity in attempting to render them plausible. So notice what he's talking about here in terms of common sense. And I want to come and talk about this later because it becomes very much a modern idea. In fact, there's a lot to be made in common sense in terms of politics. But where I would like to jump, there's really some cool stuff here. And please go through it and read specifically what I have outlined. But what I'd like to jump to is on page 506. He has these 4 rules for the conduct of the mind. The very last line of page 506, he says, and since the multiplicity of laws often provides excuses for vices, so that a state is much better ruled when it has but a few laws, and when they are very strictly observed. Likewise, in place of the large number of precepts of which logic is composed, I believe the following 4 rules would be sufficient for me, provided I made firm and constant resolution not even to fail to observe them. So what he's saying is, if we want to arrive at truth, we need to have few and simple rules. Now, where he's going with this is, in the medieval period, the rules of logic to discover if something is true or false can be quite complicated. And he's going to give us then these 4 rules that can help us, excuse me, to determine what is true. First, he said, the first was never to accept anything as true that I did not plainly know to be such. That is to say, to carefully to avoid any hasty judgment and prejudice. So what is he saying here? Don't accept things unless you know for sure. And you could sort of understand this as don't believe in authority. The second, to divide each of the difficulties I would examine into as many parts as possible, and as was required in order to resolve them. So what does that mean? Analyze difficulties. Okay? And what is to analyze? To break into parts. Then the third, to conduct my thoughts in an orderly fashion, by commencing with those objects that are simplest and easy to know, in order to ascend little by little, as by degrees, to the knowledge of the most composite things. So start with simple things and move to complex. Okay? And then our last rule here, number 4, and the last, everywhere to make enumeration so complete and review so general that I'm assured of having omitted nothing. So then, go back and review. Okay, now, how does this apply to us? So here's kind of the deal. So first of all, don't accept things. How does this apply to the course? So these 4 rules, if you apply them, the conclusion is that these things will give you certain knowledge. Okay. Now, the way Descartes meant it, it was kind of scientific, but we can apply the same thing to our course, and I want to show you kind of what I mean. So don't accept things unless you know for sure, right? So in other words, read yourself. In other words, you could totally go online, and pretty much every guy that I'm assigning you in this class, you could find on SparkNotes or Wikipedia or whatever it is, and you could find somebody else telling you what Descartes said. But you'll never arrive at certainty or truth if you do that. So in other words, you need to read for yourself in the course, right? So that you don't just accept something that someone else told you about whatever thinker we're talking about, but you know it for yourself. Number 2, analyze the problems. So that is, when you're reading, you break the reading down in your mind. And what I mean by that is, so let's say over here you read something. You know this happens, right? Is that, say, okay, so any questions on what you just read? And if it's really complex, you'll tend to have this big cloud of just confusion, right? Where someone says, so any questions? You don't even know where to start asking questions. Well, this nobody can help you with. But what he's saying is, so the first thing you do is you start to break this thing down, right? And so when you break it into pieces, then you can understand each piece. And when you understand a piece, move to understand the next piece and the next piece, etc. And so that's what he means by number 2, to analyze your problem. So if you don't understand it, break it into its component parts. Now, if you go back to what we're reading, the small parts are essentially paragraphs. So as long as you stop and make sure that you understand each paragraph at a time, or each section at a time, then you're not going to let anything get past you. And then he says, starts with the simple and moves to the complex. So in other words, put together what you know into the big picture. And so we could say, well, if you're reading along, right, and you go through this process, you break things down, and suppose these are, paragraphs in the reading, right? And so you're like, okay, so this paragraph, they all come together. Oh, and these 4 paragraphs are actually making point X. And so once I put all these things together, I'm like, oh, okay, so now I can understand the larger picture, which is X. And that's how you begin to put things together so that you see the big picture. And then lastly, go back and review. In other words, read your own notes. So, during the lectures, well, what are you going to call them? Video lectures that we're going to do. I'm going to walk you through, and I'm going to do, I'm going to do this together with you, parts 2 and 3. However, what you need to do then is make sure you go back, right, and you read the notes that you take, and you review the things, the pieces that are all come together so that you understand what's going on. And so this discourse on method was an attempt by Descartes to show how we can have scientific knowledge of anything certain. But it actually works very well in undertaking to understand anything with an amount of certainty. And indeed, this is kind of how I've done the course. And so this is the whole setup. You do the reading, you analyze it with me, right? We workshop and we analyze together. We're going to break things to the simple and move to the complex. And then you're going to go back on your own and review and make sure you understand it. And that's basically the methodology of this course. It's simple, but not easy.